Hey, Derek, what's happening, man? I appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Hey, Adam, thanks for having me. Good to see you again. It's only been what, like almost 8 years?
Yes, we were just reminiscing of how we had a poolside chat over in the Hamptons. A group of us all got together. You came out and taught a unique continuing education weekend where we're all hanging by the pools with easel boards and a big poster, and you're over there lecturing to us, and then we're just all hanging out in the pool, hanging out. So it was great.
Yeah, it was very different, and like we were saying, it'd be nice to get back to that kind of informal but advanced sort of environment for education.
Yes. Listen, you've been a leader and an expert in the world of speed, and especially when we talk about hamstring injuries, but also in just overall performance. So, would love to just give some background for those that may be unfamiliar with your work as to like what's your origin story, real quick, so we can get insight to who you are. But then, like, really, let's jump into some of the nitty gritty that we want to talk about here today.
Yeah, long story short, competed in track and field through high school. I did other sports too, but track and field in high school, university at the national level in Canada. And then went off to do a grad degree in Montreal and just decided to coach. Like, hey, I got nothing else to do. No more university eligibility. Let's try coaching and enjoyed it. Focused on jumps, hurdles, sprints, so the speed and power side and just kind of I worked in something unrelated to sport for about 5 years, but I was still coaching, and then at some point I'm like, okay, let's do this, let's make a go of it. So transition more into like the strength and conditioning, physical preparation side, and worked at the university level, worked in private sector, worked with national teams, Olympic teams, and then eventually I would say about 15 years ago started working more in professional sport. So NFL, soccer, Major League Soccer, then got into eventually baseball, ice hockey, and basketball as well, NBA. So had a chance to touch on every professional sport, at least in North America, and found some commonalities that I could kind of exist in, a groove I could exist in around speed, and some of the rehab related to that, doing speed related, sprint related rehab. And it's gone pretty well, and have my own courses that I call runningmechanics.com, and teach everybody, like physical therapists, performance coaches, fitness trainers, teachers. I'll do stuff locally with like local high schools and try to help them out as well. So it's been a full circle, and now I'm getting more involved with some of the equipment companies and the technology companies.
You mentioned, found some similarities as the extensive background you have across a lot of major sports leagues, a lot of, different ages, different genders. The word you said was commonalities, and really high level. Like, were there any key commonalities you noticed that we can all learn from rather than trying to everybody make their own niche and specificity of it? There's probably a lot that we're all doing that's similar. Like, what were those commonalities?
Well, I think a lot of the time people, like even with something as simple as like sprinting and accelerating, people are always trying to over specialize. Like, okay, if you work with baseball, everybody has to start with this lateral stance, like they're on the base, or if you're working with football, everybody's out of a 3-point start. So it's almost kind of cliche-ish. Whereas I just found when I worked with an athlete like this past summer here, I worked with an NHL prospect who's in training camp now and preseason now. And I just kept it really basic. Like, it's like you're like a track athlete, a young track athlete. We're going to work on drills. We're going to work on acceleration. We didn't put a stick in his hand. We didn't put him on rollerblades. We didn't throw snowballs at him or whatever, right? Like, we kept it very generic, and we got really good results. So I think that seems to be the commonality for me, is like, let's not over intellectualize. Let's not over customize or specialize in what your sport is, because they get enough of that. If anything, they probably have too much of that. So it's nice for them to come work with me, and I'm not talking about their sport, where I think maybe 20 years ago that was a real attractive thing, like sports specificity. Like, you're going to work with me because I'm an expert in speed for ice hockey players or speed for baseball players. And it's like, quite honestly, speed is speed in terms of like output at the hip and elasticity and all these things that contribute to running fast. So I think if you're starting out now, sometimes it's okay to be working on just basic, boring fundamentals. And I think that's what I'm trying to teach in my courses, but I'm trying to dress it up a bit as well to say, like, hey, this can still be exciting, but we don't have to put on football pads and a helmet when we're doing our sprints.
I agree with the idea of maybe over specialization, and not in the sense of over specialization of, you think about the youth baseball player here in America, they're playing 11 months out of the year. Like, we understand that side of specialization, but from the training perspective, I appreciate you sharing that, because as we're going to get into, perhaps there's this, we're missing the general adaptations that we probably all should be able to do as athletes. And we continually learn that some of these general adaptations, you think about max sprint speed, you think about max aerobic speed, max strength, right? All these are just general qualities that ultimately across every sport are protective against injury or enhance performance. So the question around how specific, like you said, in the baseball situation or the football situation relative to stance, how important is that? And if you work on, like you said, the foundational basics, is that where the biggest is the juice worth the squeeze there? That's kind of where my mind goes when you were talking about that. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean, it's like the Bruce Lee thing where he'd rather fight somebody who's worked on 10,000 kicks than one person who's worked on one kick for 10,000 times. Like, the repetition of doing something very basic is where I see the return. So if it's, let's just work on 10 meters, 10 yards of acceleration, we can work from different start positions, but it's the accumulation of acceleration, the density of that work that's going to advance somebody and create the adaptations that you want that last over the long term. Now, if I change that and say, like, now we're going to do it through a speed ladder, and then we're going to do it with a weight sled, and then we're going to do it throwing a med ball, and then we're going to do it like 50 different iterations of that, I think it dilutes the adaptation potential of just accelerating. That's been my experience, and I see that in a lot of the work that I do, where let's say like pulling sleds or resisted sprinting. Let's use that as an example. I've seen everything shift all the way to that, where when I go and observe other people train, they think all acceleration has to be resisted. So like a friend of mine, who's a track coach, he says, yeah, it's like the strength and conditioningification of sprinting, where if you're a sprint coach, yeah, you do a little bit of resisted work, and a lot of it's for postural, teaching, and there's obviously a physiological benefit to some degree, but teaching somebody how to accelerate without pulling something or distraction is where you're going to get the most return. And so I think that's what I'm always thinking about, is how do I get more of the fundamental stuff in there so that you're accumulating good reps, high quality, good biomechanics, and you get a great return at the end. And then sprinting becomes intuitive, sprinting becomes reflexive, and then they don't have to think about it. But if you're constantly cueing them and giving them different tasks to do, run around this cone, turn left, look at that, catch the ball, they get a lot of that within the context of their sport practice anyway. So why am I duplicating that?
It begs the question. The various periodization models that have just transcended over the years, like the original block periodization, let the main thing be the main thing, may be the most beneficial when you're talking about trying to make an adaptation. Like you said, the density, the repetition. Repetition is needed, the density is needed, but if you start clouding it, I think nowadays, right, the influence of social media, you mentioned business and technology, right? Everyone wants a piece of it, and they got to kind of make it their own and add a little twist to it, a little flair to it. Now all of a sudden, like you said, you've got 101 ways you're trying to accelerate, but you never actually work on acceleration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you put the nail on the head there, was the idea that people are trying to make it their own and unique to them and everything. And it's like, okay, great. I understand that. I understand there's a marketing component to our careers. But even something as simple as that 10 by 10 repetitions that I do, where run down, accelerate, run back, back and forth, there's a lot of benefit to that. But I see people like changing it. Oh, we're going to do it with this, and we're going to do it with a sled, or we're going to do it around curves. And it's like, no, 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 no. Just do what I told you to do. And I'll even with some of the teams that I work with, I'll give them something very basic, and then when they send me video back, they've changed it, and it's like, no. If I wanted you to change it, I would have suggested you change it, but at least get X number of reps, or the percentage, a certain percentage or proportion of reps, like I programmed it, and then you're going to see the benefit. But it's like giving you a recipe, and you're like, well, I really like salt, right? And so you're adding more salt in, it's going to ruin it, right? So we all know that. I've been doing more cooking lately, so I've ruined a few recipes.
Cooking's a great analogy there, right? It's like if it's not broke, why fit? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Is that the expression, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
you know, and then what I've experienced too, and this is coming from a space of working in large teams, right? People want autonomy and creativity over their craft, and I think we have a tough time, just like you said, hey, here's the plan. All you got to do is follow it, and then once you've hit these benchmarks, okay, now you can break the rules, right? But you got to know the rules first before you can break them. So I hear you, and I've seen similar experiences with that, and it's tough because then, and in actuality, when you think about like the scientific method, right? Well, how do you know if Derek's plan worked if you've already made these subtle tweaks? So now all of a sudden the coach is frustrated. Derek, this plan's not working. And you're thinking they're saying, yeah, but you haven't even done the foundational
yeah.
program yet because you've made some subtle twists. So I appreciate you calling that out. And hopefully we get better and recognize that, the simple and general things do work, right? Like Mike Boyle's constantly said, hey, keep it simple, silly, right? KISS method. There is value to that when we're chasing these adaptations.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm sure you and I aren't immune to that as well. Like I've done stupid
Mm.
things where I've taken something and changed, and you're just like, oh, like I have to go back into my notes and see how it was supposed to be, and you're like, okay, okay, let's just, like you said, keep it simple and not try to be a hero.
You referred to earlier, you got, you've built some courses, and big reason why you're here is I want to learn about one of your upcoming courses. And I want to segue into this, what the course is going to be up here out in Scottsdale in November, and lead into it what the 10 by 10 is, because I believe that's going to be something you're going to talk about with the course. So could you give us some insights to what you're bringing out here alongside our friend and colleague Andrew Hauser to talk about more about the performance and recovery side of things, but like you had already alluded to, the 10 by 10 when we start talking about true methodology. Could you shed some insight into that?
Sure, sure. And I had the opportunity to meet Andrew back in 2019. He attended one of my courses when I was in Dallas and participated and gave me some good feedback. And he was still involved in professional baseball at that time. And then now he's in the private sector. So we've continued to talk over the years. And I like what he's doing because it's not, I mean, to some degree, philosophically, he does some of the same things I do, but he does a whole other area, covers a whole other area of rehab and assessment that I'm, that's not my wheelhouse. So it's nice to be able to connect with somebody and co-present with somebody who can complement what you do. And to some degree, it's almost, I'm not going to say it's in opposition to what I do, but it's on the other side of the spectrum in terms of some of the stuff that he's exploring right now that I think to some degree I may have neglected. And it's funny, we talked a bit about this, but this idea that you go through your career and you start to narrow your focus, but then as you narrow your focus, you forget some things that were part of your training program or things that you've done, and you've kind of weeded them out. And there's no reason for that. You just, if anything, it's almost like you're making room for new things. But it's like the John Wooden quote: "The problem with new books is that you forget to read the old ones." And I think that happens a lot. So getting reintroduced to Andrew's stuff, which we'll get into some details here, has been refreshing for me, and I'm applying it to some of the projects I'm working on, my own personal fitness, and I've noticed a huge improvement. So with the course, we're trying to incorporate, sort of areas that we both specialize in, and then integrate technology to help explain why this is important in a performance and a recovery and a rehabilitation context. And say, okay, for example, I do my 10 by 10 shuttles. So accelerate 10 meters or 10 yards, decelerate 10, turn around, do it back, back and forth 5 times, 100 yards or 100 meters per set, take a break, do it again. You can do it, quite a few sets. The whole idea behind that was it was a rehab protocol for hamstring rehabilitation, and I won't go into all the history of it, but certainly it was something that was introduced to me back in the 1980s. So it's like old technology. It's and it was run by coaches. It wasn't necessarily run by sports scientists or rehab professionals. Even though one of the guys that originated it was a sports med doctor, he was also a track coach. So I've taken that, and I found that by doing that rehabilitation protocol, everybody got very fit and very proficient at accelerating. So I've turned that into more of a performance protocol. And then there's nuance to it. So depending how you work your work to rest ratios, you can make it a speed protocol. You can make it a repeat speed protocol. You can make it a conditioning protocol. You can make it a rehab protocol. And the nuance of how to adjust it is very subtle and is very simple, but you can have profound effects. And it's kind of like a catch-all type protocol where, hey, we only have, like, I had this issue with, it wasn't an issue, but with the Kansas City Chiefs back in 2019, before the season before their first Super Bowl win. And they're like, we're running out of one, field space and time in order to get certain workouts in. And I said, okay, well, why don't you just do this 10 by 10 protocol? It's easy for all the positions to do, even the linemen to do it, the heavy guys, and they'll get better conditioning. They'll get better at accelerating. It's relatively risk free in terms of like pulling a muscle because it's so short, but it'll get them into shape in a safe and efficient way. And everybody did better on their conditioning tests, and they won the Super Bowl, not because of me. It was Patrick Mahomes, but and Andy Reid. But certainly that was a scalable solution that worked really well for that scenario. And so now I've gone into a little more depth of like analyzing it with timing gates. I've talked to Andrew about looking at some cardiac adaptations that happen, whether it's with general heart rate monitoring or using the Moxie monitor to look at localized blood flow and muscle oxygenization. So that's sort of the level of detail we're going to get into. And we're going to use the 10 by 10 protocol is almost like a demonstration of, okay, we're going to look at timing technology. We might include it as a GPS assessment so we can get sort of real-time acceleration. He's going to have Moxie monitors on them. We might have just a general heart rate monitor. I don't know what else we can strap onto somebody, but certainly we're going to try to get as much information out of the 10 by 10 protocol as we can. And that'll help us to explain, what the effect of different changes and nuances are on whatever your desired goal is. If it's conditioning, okay, shift it this way, see what happens to localized blood flow. If it's more alactic, speed and power, well, let's do it this way. And, we'll show how you need extra recovery for that. So I think that's going to be kind of the foundation of our early dive into some of this stuff, because it's a good physiological experiment to do and show people. And then we can start to break it down from there. And there's ways that you can morph the 10 by 10 into 5 by 20, 7 by 15, 5 by 20, 4 by 25. Like each set should equal about 100 yards or 100 meters. And there's some reasons for that. But you can change it into a short to long acceleration protocol. You can use it for long distance runners to work on building strength. So I think there's a lot of things that we're going to cover with just even that protocol without getting into some of the other stuff on rehab.
I'm excited to learn about that because there's a lot of things you talked about that I want to just like double click on all of it, but I want to save it for when you're actually out here. But one thing I want to ask, like, since you've been implementing the 10 by 10, you've mentioned you've been using it and been aware of it and learned of it years ago. From when you started using it to where you're at now, like how has either your perspective or your philosophy around the information you glean from it impact your decisions around training and or rehab?
Yeah, I think what it started was just obviously a return to play protocol. So, okay, somebody's hurt, they're going to do this because it's safe and it's effective in terms of maintaining their preparedness. And then it kind of it became a bit of a conditioning protocol more so because, again, at the end of a practice or at the end of a workout, hey, let's do a couple of sets of this because I know it's going to catch some things we might have missed in the workout. And everybody likes to get a little more workout in, and it's better than doing gassers or whatever else you could possibly do. But now, since we've been timing and monitoring it, we're starting to see some trends around how it can be used for performance and speed. And even looking at things like when I work with Charlie Francis, he was always looking at ways of breaking down distances. So if you were training somebody to run the 100 meters, but you were in an indoor facility that only had 30 meters to sprint, well, let's do reps of 3 by 30 or 4 by 30 with short breaks, like sprint 30, sprint back, sprint, whatever, however you make it work out. And then you would basically cover off, it's like energy system requirement, right? Because of the duration of doing the sprint. Now, mechanically, it's very different because it's all acceleration based. You're not getting into an upright position. So does it help with max velocity? Well, if it improves acceleration, it does contribute eventually to max velocity. But does it specifically address max velocity? No, but we can get to that at a later time when we get outside and the weather's better. So I think I'm starting to look at the 10 by 10 as a more precise protocol for addressing like specific needs. Like, again, are we just working on acceleration? Because you could conceivably say that through the density of work, so we're doing multiples of 10, maybe you're doing like 40, 50 reps of 10 within a session. Okay, well, they're going to get better at 10. We can all agree that by doing more 10s, you're probably going to get better at accelerating. Now, does that have a general stimulus effect that will improve max velocity to 40 meters or yards, 50, 60? I don't know. Maybe it does. Maybe there's some sort of general effect that improves organism strength or whatever and creates an adaptation beyond the specifics of the event or the activity. So I'm always thinking about that, because I remember one time I was sitting down with Charlie and we were talking to an athlete, and it was an Eastern Bloc athlete, and they were talking about how they didn't do a lot of max velocity work, but they did hundreds and hundreds of reps of plyos. And he thought that there was a conversion effect of doing all of those jumps that created a general adaptation that allowed them to handle max velocity. And I'm like, okay, at the time it was very abstract. And I'm like, I don't really understand what you're saying. But now, 20 years later, after that meeting, I'm starting to see those effects of like, if you hammer away at something that may seem unrelated, there could be, I don't even know what to call it, but a generalized effect that makes you stronger at something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the phrase that comes to mind is transfer to sport is the phrase that comes to mind. You
Yeah,
think about
there's a transfer, but
you
it's
think
not like ultra specific. It's something you have to like let your brain relax and go like, oh, okay, I get it. You're stronger in this, so you get stronger in that. Yeah.
I think like if you take it to physics, right? And you think about what we know is like, hey, if you want to sprint faster, you probably need to be stronger. And so what we have seen is, hey, if you have a stronger back squat, let's just use like a really crude example.
Yeah.
Stronger back squat, you tend to see max velocity and acceleration increase. Well, if we think about the formula of what that is, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. If I improve force output, vice versa, if I improve acceleration output, I'm going to flip everything else as well, right? Just this big equation when you're manipulating those variables. So as you're talking about this, I think, yeah, we're talking like we're talking about earlier as far as generality versus specificity. If we make these general adaptations to the system, and then the body can then take let's just call it the motor learning or the skill acquisition of sprinting, jumping, throwing, right? You would imagine the systemic adaptation can be applied in a couple different means, whether it be straight ahead running, whether it be running a route, whether it be chasing down a
Yes.
defender in soccer. These general adaptations, quote unquote, transfer to those more specific skills, but the constituents are still there.
Yeah, like a friend of mine, Italian friend of mine, Giuseppe, I mean, he put it in very blunt terms. He said, what we're trying to do with a lot of these protocols is we're trying to create that systemic adaptation that you're referring to. It's almost like if, you put somebody on anabolic steroids and said, go play tennis, right? They're going to get better at tennis because they have this general sort of adaptation serum that's going to make them adapt better in their sport, whatever. And I think that was an old school way of doing things back in the day. Like, hey, go play football, go take some steroids, you'll get better at football, right? Now, I'm not promoting that, but I am promoting it in terms of like creating that general systemic adaptation effect through exercise prescription. And I think if people can grab their heads around that, and even this idea like with muscle stimulation, there's or even exercise and rehab. So if you have like one arm that you broke, well, if you do throws with this arm, it'll help this arm. Like there's a crossover effect. So even they found with electrical stimulation, if you put it on one arm and you're trying to treat another arm, say you had like lacerations or something that's contraindicated for putting stim pads on there. Well, if you do it on the other arm, it still travels to the brain, and the brain has to process what's going on and go like, well, I'll make the adaptation to that side too, from a neuroplasticity point of view, or whatever you want to call it. So I think I'm always thinking of having, a stressor on the system that's going to have systemic effects and benefit. So that doesn't mean being ultra specific. It means like, hey, let's just relax and do some general stuff, and we'll see that what the benefits are. And since I've been working with Andrew, he's like, yeah, like, developing the aerobic system has, Charlie Francis said this too. Like, if we make your aerobic system more efficient, the heat throughout your body's going to go up, the circulation and the regeneration is going to be better. So you're going to have better recovery. You're going to have better nerve conduction because it's a warmer environment, and you're just going to have better overall effects. So I've been doing more long, slow distance runs as part of my exercise program, which I'm not an aerobic athlete. Like, it just sucks, like, mentally, to go for like a 30, 45-minute run. I'm doing it with my wife. She was more of a runner, long distance runner. And, but I'm finding like less back pain, less knee pain, less, better sleep. I feel better and recover better in my weight workouts and my sprint workouts. So, sometimes you have to look away from, the obvious answer.
It's funny you say the not funny, but I just want to raise a discussion point here. When you talk about, hey, my knees start to feel better, we start to increase circulation throughout the body, start talking about more, hey, a larger aerobic system. When I hear that, the thing that comes to mind is, let's just look at pathology and let's just look at tendinopathies. In tendinopathies, what happens is there's a neovascularization that occurs because you're trying to bring blood flow to a tissue. And so you think about, well, if you increase the aerobic system, if we try to increase tissue temperature, try to increase blood flow throughout the body, like you said, improved recovery, probably decreased risk for injury, right? So sometimes you just got to go to the extremes and think of, hey, pathologically, when we do hit pathology, or we do hit injuries, how does the body respond? Oh, we want to increase blood flow. I
Yeah,
wonder if I increase blood flow systemically as a general adaptation, what does that do for performance?
absolutely. Like, everybody's been following this, like, Christian McCaffrey tendonitis issue, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he's going to go to Germany to get what done? Probably some sort of regenerative procedure that involves like PRP and growth factors and all that. When, like you said, if systemically, and again, I don't know much about his training. All I see is like he sprints and jumps a lot. And even his father said maybe that was the problem. So maybe he wasn't doing enough of the low intensity stuff that we're talking about to increase systemic blood flow and feed the tissues. I don't know. Maybe that's the issue, but I would certainly revisit that as part of his training if I was involved.
This is a great segue of a question I would love to pose to you, because we talked about it earlier. This is great. You brought up, tendinopathy in a current NFL player, and we have seen an uptick in the prevalence of Achilles ruptures. And what you had just mentioned is like, hey, like a lot of speed, a lot of jumping. Dad comes out and says, yeah, he's sprinting, he's jumping a lot, right? And so my theoretical working idea is, the world of run specific isometrics and localized isometric training has been very popularized over the last 3 to 5 years. And when we think about what isometric training is, and a lot of those training protocols are short duration, right? Like overcoming short duration isometrics. I've just been thinking about, well, we're increasing stiffness at a tendon and a muscle tendinous junction, but what about the muscle itself? Like, I believe there's value to all the true muscle actions of concentric, eccentric, yielding, overcoming, doing all of it. So I just wonder, it's just this theory I have and want to throw it your way. I don't even know what my question is, but just asking, have we as an industry swung the pendulum too far around the training interventions of isometrics, because they don't produce as much soreness, so athletes don't get as sore during the season, or hey, it's quick, we can microdose them, and then we don't have to work on other qualities. But then ultimately, like, what about the long duration 60 to 90 second isometrics, right? And we talk about blood flow, some of the work that I'm sure Andrew's going to talk about. When you do those extensive isometrics, you start to see peripheral adaptations, you start to see increases in blood flow. So my question is let's just keep it simple. That's my perspective. Why do you think there's been this epidemic of, let's say we talked about tendinopathy with one player, but this epidemic of Achilles ruptures?
I mean, there's a lot of speculation around that. Everybody talks about shoes and surfaces as well. So that's a whole other discussion. I think it's not necessarily the primary cause, but it certainly exacerbates some of the issues that you're identifying. And especially with tendon stiffness, like, if, I think, like anything, you're looking for a balance. Like, yes, the tendon has to have some degree of extensibility. It has to have some degree of stiffness. It has to, have a good blood supply and all these things. But if the pendulum swings too far and all you're doing is you're shifting everything to isometrics, you're going to lose something else. Like, and it may be long, slow, aerobic, cyclical activity that drops off the map, which again may condition it in a more specific manner in terms of the stretch reflex combined with a certain level of circulation, and how it strengthens the foot, and how you impact the ground. So I think I think it's going to go back to like this holistic view of like what is training. Because if in the, like, an example would be like, what's been the biggest innovation? I'm not going to say innovation, but what's the go-to for a lot of people when you have hamstring injuries or in a sport or in a whatever, in a community? It's like Nordic
I,
hamstring curls, right? So
mhm.
okay, the problem is there's not enough eccentric strength, and that's why we're getting these injuries. So the pendulum shifts all the way over to like slow eccentric exercise, right? Look, there's still a whole bunch of hamstring injuries in Australian football, and where it all came from, and the Nordboard came from. I'm not crapping on the Nordboard, but I'm just saying, like, it shifts all the way to one side, and it's like, okay, well, what are your running volumes? How much acceleration are you doing? How much emphasis are you putting on running biomechanics? Or is it just like, no, let's just do Nordboard? Because if that's your solution, you're going to still have problems, right? That's a very, very specific fix, just like doing tendon specific isometrics, that takes you away from other things that could be part of the solution as well. And I think, and so maybe from a sports science point of view, that ultra micro examination is what people are emphasizing right now, rather than going back like, okay, yes, we can do a little more of that, fit it in, and then still retain this and this, right? And and some people are getting away from things like Olympic lifting and certain types of weightlifting movements. So everything is trap bar deadlift now because it's easier. I don't have to coach, whatever, right? And then it's like, well, okay, but if that's center of body, pulling from the anterior point of the body puts more posterior stress, and maybe we're missing that now. So, and then people will say like, well, why would we do Olympic lifting for sprinters when we could just pull a sled and get their strength out of the sled? Well, if you've ever pulled a sled, it puts a lot more stress on your calves and your Achilles and your feet, and because you're ramping out, and that could create a new problem, right? It's just, it just shifts, like, this whole thing of like, hey, let's go to electric cars. Well, now there's lithium poisoning and blah, and the cars blow up and whatever, right? It just if you shift too much, it's going to create new problems, right? Like, and maybe some combination of internal combustion and batteries and solar, like everybody wants to polarize the discussion. Am I
It's
wrong?
and you, I, no, and here's my no, here's my. You're absolutely right, and here's my perspective on it. It's the easy solution. It's simple. It's reductionist. It's complexity is hard, right? Complexity is hard. Integration is hard. Being able to zoom out and zoom in at the same time, like everything you just talked about, is like, hey, probably you're right. Sled acceleration, sled pulling, and sled running, resisted running, right? All these devices that are coming out here. Yes, that can help that. And well, what about just unweighted? What about just working on it without the resistance, right? Because now that takes the stress off, like you said, calf or Achilles. So I look at it and say, from as you were sharing all that perspective, I think yes, it's the oversimplification of it or swinging the pendulum too far. It's a solution, but at the end of the day, it doesn't address the complexity of everything else. And so that probably begs the question, like, well, so you're saying we should do everything, Adam and Derek, right? Like, no. We recognize that you can't do everything, and we're not saying we have the secret sauce that says yes, do this. And I think where we get to is like we were talking about earlier, how we try to make it our own, or you try to be your niche. So you focus on like, hey, this is my methodology. This is what I do. You come see me. This is what we're going to work on, rather than saying, actually, we kind of need this whole robust thing, and not exactly sure exactly what it is that you're going to need, but we're going to make sure we hit a couple different things to create these general adaptations. So then hopefully, in theory, and then also from your practical experience, and I'd like to think maybe my experience as well, we tend to
Yeah.
see that these general adaptations do reduce the risk of injury. They do help improve performance,
Yeah.
irregardless of what methodology you believe in.
Yeah. Like, do we do everything? Well, no. But do you watch the series The Bear? The
Yeah,
cooking?
great series.
Yeah. It's a great series, right? So there's got to be some non-negotiables, right? Where it's like, we have to do this, and this. Like, there's a hierarchy of things that must be done. And yes, you can do some isometrics and you can do some Nordic curls, and but we still have to retain these non-negotiables, which would be very basic fundamental things. And maybe that's what's missing. Like, there's too much variability, there's too much customization or personalization or whatever. Like, I got to be known as this guy. Like, I only do this. And it's like, no. You don't have to differentiate yourself by just excluding things, right? but I think that happens a lot. Like, and like an example would be Mike Boyle says we don't do back squats, and then there's a whole you know community that he alienates, right? Because there's people who have success with back squats, right? And there's people who have success with front squats, and right. But you don't have to, just be a front squat only guy or a single leg only guy or whatever. Like, take from that guy's experience and pull what you think is useful, right? The Bruce Lee thing, right? Like, but I think you're right. It just becomes too complex for some people and they just want a template.
Here's my hope, and I wonder if you share the same sentiment. And my hope is with the power of technology it's becoming more accessible. Data sets across the world are becoming larger. Sample sizes are becoming larger. And then like I want to pull, like I want to double click into, what a lot of, concierge medical, doctors are doing now, and they're pursuing longevity, right? That's the buzzword now, right? And we're learning, hey, like these are some physical qualities that are protective to lifespan. And then you look into the performance literature, and in actuality, the same qualities that are protective over death, over all cause mortality, are the same ones that are protective over injury. So like where I'm optimistic is, and I'm going to, shout out to Vald, a company you and I are both familiar with, they're starting to put out a lot of normative data reports. My hope is that regardless what your training philosophy is, the methodology you believe in, when you talk about, I love how you said non-negotiables and prioritizing your non-negotiables, right? You think about like a soccer athlete, let's say something you and I are both familiar with. Mm-hmm. Let's just say, hey, and you said the Nordics. Well, listen, we've got this technology, the NordBoard, and it's been used around the world. And what we can say is one key component of a injury risk mitigation model would be, hey, doesn't matter your age, your gender, whatever, like you should probably have this as your standard. Hey, if you hit this as your standard as a peak output, great. Touch it. Don't forget about it. Don't say, no, we can't ever not look at it again. Maybe you touch it from like, when you think about like an undulating periodization model, touch it less frequently, but still touch it. And then, hey, let's look at some other normative data and have a standard too. Because where my mind goes is I think we're all human beings at the end of the day. Like we are all the same species. Yes, we have genetic components that separate us, but we all have to run fast, run for a long time, jump high, and change direction. How do we, as an industry, take away the capitalism of it and say, these are, I love this, your non-negotiables per sport, per athlete, per gender, and just make that the priority. And then if your athlete can do all those non-negotiables really well, hey, get creative, have fun with it, throw whatever gadgets, tech you want at it. But if we don't even hit those non-negotiables, are we really even serving these athletes, even the active adults that want to increase their lifespan? Are we even serving them in the best way that we can?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think even going back to that series, The Bear, like maybe we should have people polishing more forks and cutlery, right? Like before they move on to the more complex things. And maybe we're almost enabling and empowering people too quickly with the technology to some degree. And, I had a case where we did a rehab with a collegiate football player, and he had like 6 hamstring pulls leading up to my involvement. And we just had him do the 10 by 10 and acceleration based stuff. Don't do anything else. Just do that. And then they came back to me later and said, wow, we retested him on the NordBoard and his scores were way better than when we were doing Nordics. And I'm like, okay, great. That's a good use of the technology, is like, do we have to do Nordics to get them better hamstring strength? Well, no. So, okay, but at least we do have a way to test that and say, like, yes, they've checked off that box of that threshold that you were referring to. And we can that means we're in the right area of the type of training we're doing, and we won't get these overuse issues. So, yeah, I think if you can pull good information from the data and the technology and make it and allow your process to evolve in a way that you've got all your boxes checked and your bases covered, then that's a smart way of doing things. But certainly don't let the technology drive you into areas that really aren't part of your process. And I think that happens sometimes. Like people, like, hey, let's get some force plates and do lots of jumps. And it's like, okay, well, now what? Right. So, yeah. So I think, yeah. Yeah.
Like the question around technology is like, if you're going to, you can measure everything nowadays and things are more affordable. And if you don't have technology, it kind of looks like, well, what are you really doing? But with that, right, if you're going to incorporate the technology or assess something, the question I always have to ask myself is, if I collect this piece of data, is it going to impact what I do with the athlete? If yes, great, let's incorporate it. If no, and it's just a nice to have thing, I'd rather spend my time and energy elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. Like I was talking to this doctor about like the hamstring rehab protocol, and he said it was developed at a time when we couldn't get MRIs, we couldn't look at the tissue, right? So we had to be smarter about how we progress things and how we analyze them from a coaching point of view or a biomechanical point of view. And then so now we can. I've worked with teams where they can get an MRI like that, and it
Mm-hmm.
actually it paralyzes the process because, oh look, we saw something, stop everything, right? And it's like, well, no, we can still do stuff. And yeah, you keep looking at those photos, but the athlete is showing, they can do this work. They feel good. They're not sore the next day. So we're going to keep along this progression. But you let us know if you see anything. But it's a balanced assessment. It's not like yes or no. Like we can't do it. We can't do this because there's fluid in around the injury site. So it's interesting.
Image Imaging is a big part of professional sports, and I will say this: speaking on, I've subscribed to the camp of image everything, and I've subscribed to the camp of hey, image if something clinically doesn't make sense. And I think in professional sports and nowadays, especially when you talk about the NFL, the NBA, some of these athletes, you're talking multi-million-dollar investments. So what's a $300 MRI going to really matter if that's going to give you more information to
Yeah.
that? The challenge I have experienced is a lot of people want access to the results of that image. And then a lot of people that may have not had the knowledge that you have, the experience of working in sports or the medical background of someone like myself, recognize that just because the image says something, that doesn't mean like that's the end all be all. We it's very easy, right? When we think about, we were talking about this earlier, simplify, reductionist approach. It's very easy to understand, oh, I see something, that is the problem. When in actuality, you and I both know structure often suggests function, and it's not the complete picture when you're talking about a complex being, that being us as humans.
Yeah, and I mean, if I look at an MRI, I don't know what I'm seeing. Like even when I saw my children's ultrasounds, like I was like, that looks like a baby. I guess that's a head, right? So you need somebody who's very skilled to analyze that stuff as well, and you may need to get multiple opinions, and so it's nice to be able to have, a radiologist that can give you good information about the interpretation, and that doesn't always exist, right? And like you said, everybody wants to look at it, but does everybody see the same thing?
Yes.
So
Derek, I want to keep talking and keep just hashing out all this. Like, we maybe have to get you back on. If not, we will catch up for sure when you're out here, because this has just been so much fun. I've just been able to ask you questions that have just been sitting up here, and you've delivered a phenomenal responses. So I appreciate you taking the time, man. This was awesome.
well, it all starts with good questions, right? And I remember talking to somebody about like working with Charlie Francis, and like all my good questions honestly have come at a point when he's no longer around, which is unfortunate, right? Because it does take a while for you to digest everything and then experience that stuff. And then if you don't have the experience, you can't ask a good question, right? And which you seem to have done today is like you've asked some really good questions, but certainly there needs to be some education around being in a position to ask the right questions.
Absolutely. I mean, context, experience, and knowledge usually lend themselves to be able to be curious and ask those questions.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that's what happens with this event in November 16th, 17th, is that we've already had some commitments from some Major League Baseball staff and some collegiate staff. And so, an example would be like Brad Scott from the Atlanta Braves is going to be coming out. And so he's taken the 10 by 10 and he's modified it with his pitchers so that it works on the pitch count or the pitch
Mm-hmm.
clock, right? So it's like 15 seconds, do another run, 15 seconds. So that was a way to disperse the stress away from the upper body to the lower body, but they're still having good results in terms of like power production, velocity, throwing velocity, and all that. But they're not having as many injuries in that regard in the upper body. So we're going to have a lot of discussions around those types of case studies and what has worked for people. And maybe I'll leave there going, wow, okay, I learned something from, you and you. And then it helps me make a better course the next time around.
And that's what everybody hopes for, right? So, again, November 16th and 17th out here in Scottsdale. Will be over at Helix Human Performance. Great time of year to be visiting Scottsdale. Middle of
Beautiful.
November, 80-degree weather where the rest of the country's starting to get cooled up, cool off and approach winter, we will be sitting sunny, probably shorts and t-shirts. So if you want to learn some cool stuff and hang out with some cool people and enjoy some sunny weather, like that's the place to be that time of year.
Absolutely. It'll be raining in Vancouver, so I'll be heading out a couple of days early.
Fantastic. Well, hey, Derek, I appreciate you taking the time today, man. This was wonderful. And we will continue the conversation when you're back out here for the course.
Awesome. Looking forward to it, Adam. Thank you very much.